So the way this session is set up is that we've broken it up into two parts. The first part will be to discuss the coastal wetland regulations, so land subject to coastal storm flowage and other coastal proposals, and that we have about 25 to 30 minute presentation, and then we hope to have about 30 minutes for questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And I believe we also have the ability for you to raise your hand and ask the question verbally. So we will be answering questions both ways. We encourage you, these asking questions here today doesn't take the place of putting your comments in writing and submitting them in the formal manner for the regulation. So we encourage you to do that. The deadline for public comments is March 1st. At 7 o'clock, we will, roughly 7 o'clock, we will do the same with the stormwater part of these regulation updates. We'll give a presentation for about 25, 30 minutes, and then the last 30 minutes will be for stormwater questions or whatever questions you still have. And we'll do our very best to answer all the questions if we can. If there's, we'd like you to hold your questions to the end of the presentations, but if there's anything really urgent that you need for a clarifying question, we'll try to answer that. So without further ado, we're going to get started. And I want to introduce the folks that are here with me that will be helping with the presentation, starting with Stephanie Mora, the Division of Wetlands and Waterways Director at MassDEP and my boss. And Stephanie will be helping to manage the questions at the end of each of the sessions. Conducting the first coastal presentation with me is Jill Provençal from the MassDEP Northeast Regional Office, Wetlands Section, and Pam Harvey, who has been, at MassDEP for many years in a number of capacities, including, law judge and wetlands program chief. And Pam was brought back from retirement to help with this project on coastal regulations. So to get started, next slide, Jill. Okay, so the agenda for the first, for this first session, or for this first part of the session is, I'll give a high level overview of the need for these regulations. Then Jill will follow me and discuss, the functions of land subject to coastal storm flowage and how we need to learn from past storms. Then Pam will go through the proposed standards in land subject to coastal storm flowage and some of the other coastal resilience regulations that are proposed. And then finally, I'll touch on the schedule, how to comment, and then hopefully we'll have about 25, 30 minutes for questions on this part of the presentation. Next slide. So just to quickly go over the need for these regulations, they're intended to improve designs to reduce existing and increasing risk. Go back one. Yeah,
sorry.
To improve designs to reduce existing and increasing risk due to stronger coastal storms, sea level rise, and increasing precipitation that we've been seeing. The new standards will reduce storm and flood damage on development and infrastructure, and it will reduce risk to public health and safety. And most importantly, for these regulations, it's intended to protect the natural function of the floodplain to help provide these functions. Next. And so some of you may know that we've been working on developing standards for the land subject to coastal storm flowage for many years. It's been a wetland resource area in the wetlands regulations since the very beginning, but we've never had specific standards for it. And it's becoming more and more important to have that. And we've learned over the years that the having strong standards in land subject to coastal storm flowage is not just environmentally important, but it makes economic sense, and it's important to maintain the high economic status of Massachusetts. And I refer to an article in Commonwealth Magazine in October of last year, or 2022, where they referred to the big three credit rating agencies that had mostly good things to say about the Massachusetts economy, but pointed to a vulnerability in that based on our potential for coastal storms and flooding in Massachusetts. And specifically, they referred to the S&P rating in 2022, where they said that they consider Massachusetts environmental risks moderately negative in the credit rating because of coastal exposure, and specifically in the combined Boston and Cape Cod area, exposing the state to significant economic disruption following a high impact event. And so having standards for that will protect the function of land subject to coastal storm flowage is important, not just environmentally, but to keep the Massachusetts economy strong. On that point, I'm now going to turn it over to Jill, and Jill will explain how land subject to coastal storm flowage functions to prevent storm damage and promote flood control, and also how we've learned from past storms. Jill?
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Good evening, everyone. So as Lisa mentioned, land subject to coastal storm flowage is a coastal resource area that has the ability to diminish and buffer the high energy effects of storms by absorbing wave energy and flood water, reducing erosion, and dissipating a storm flow energy. So the LSCSF standards are based on the FEMA flood zones. So within LSCSF, we have the velocity zone, or V zone, that's also known as the coastal high hazard area. The V zone boundaries are determined by reference to the currently effective or preliminary firm map prepared by FEMA. And these areas are subject to high velocity wave action from storms and have a projective wave height of 3 foot or greater, or at least 3 feet of runoff. Then landward of the velocity zone is the MOWA, or area of moderate wave action, also considered a high hazard area of the A zone. These areas experience wave heights with between 1.5 feet and 3 feet, storm surge, and wave runoff. And then landward of the MOWA is the MIWA, or area of minimal wave action, also located within the A zone. And this area is considered the lower hazard portion of the A zone and is subject to wave heights less than 1.5 feet during the 1% annual chance of flood. And then the boundary you see here is the LIMWA, or limit of minimal wave action, and that is between the MIWA and the MOWA. And one thing I want to note is that the complete up-to-date LIMWA lines are only available through the FEMA Flood Map Service Center as part of the National Flood Hazard Layer, and they are not shown on MassGIS or other state viewers. And then we have the area landward of MIWA, which is the X zone. This area is currently not located within the FEMA 1% chance floodplain. So areas basically along the coast of Massachusetts primarily consist of protective coastal reservations, natural wetland resource areas, and rural to highly urbanized development. And each of these areas, regardless of its present landscape, are subject to erosion, scour, and damage from coastal storm events. So, learning from past storms. One source we look to is FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assessment Teams, or MATS, who conduct engineering analysis after major natural disasters to assess damage to government facilities, homes, businesses, and other structures, and determine the causes of structural failures and successes, with the goal of learning exactly what happened and why, and how to reduce disaster damage in the future. What we can take away from this particular analysis can assist us in how we look at rebuilding efforts, new construction, building code policies, and regulations. So in certain areas, and this is from Hurricane Sandy. So in certain areas, the map found that flow channelization tends to be highly localized, and changes in elevation can facilitate flow channelization. So in this figure, the MAT report identified flow paths A, B, C, and D coming in through here. And I'll refer back to this, but this is flow path A coming in through here. And the flow channel A resulted in washing this house back into the bay. And then flow channels B, C, and D, you can see this home here. These flow channels resulted in undermining foundations and causing the collapse of houses through these channels on the side. And also the Hurricane Sandy map also found that buildings within 20 feet of erosion control structures exposed to ocean waves almost always sustained significant flood and/or erosion damage. Another source that we use, and I'm going to say include but not limited to, the federal flood insurance claim maps, for which we can see on the landscape areas of repetitive damage from storm events. So before I pass it on to Pam, I guess I just want to say, observations, and again, I'm going to include, including but not limited to, those documented by FEMA, MassDEP, and through our Mass Coastal Storm Team. As I mentioned this afternoon, we've been a little bit busy the last week or so, is reshaping how we think about development and redevelopment within LSCSF. And we really are hopeful that through these draft regulations, we can utilize what we have learned and adapt and change past practices within LSCSF and focus on utilizing this resource area and other wetland resource areas to our advantage by restoring and preserving its capacity to provide storm damage prevention and flood control. So I will now pass the baton to Pam Harvey.
Well, thank you very much, Jill, and thank you everyone for attending tonight. I'm going to give you a walk, guide you through the regulations, and beginning with this sort of orientation to how the regulations were set up. Obviously, the landscape coastal storm flowage is a very large area within the coast. In some areas, it's wider than other areas, and it's, for the most part, is pretty developed. So these regulations will apply to a fair number of people. So we wanted to set them up in a way that they would be relatively easy to implement by commissions and DEP and for people in the regulated community. So there's some important things to understand about how the regulations are set up, and I'm going to just walk you through these quickly. First is determining whether or not a project site is only within landscape coastal storm flowage or is also within another resource area. And I have a slide that's going to cover this in a little more detail, but for the most part, the performance standards are set up. So if the site is affected by another coastal resource area, coastal bank, coastal dune, beach, other types of resource areas, the performance standards for those other resources would apply, with important exceptions about building height and then some other specific circumstances. The second thing that's important to nail down if you for a particular site is, as Jill just went through, to identify what zone within land subject to coastal storm flowage is on the site. There may be more than one, but again, the V zone, the moderate wave action zone, and the minimal wave action zone, and there the FEMA maps would determine the boundaries. I'm going to go through that as well in a bit. The next thing is whether or not a project site is previously developed or whether it's not developed. So if it's previously developed, we have provisions for redevelopment that apply, and otherwise it would be new development. So those are sort of separated in these proposed regulations. And then for as for other projects along the coast, whether or not the project's eligible for review as a limited project, and we have added, and these obviously would apply for other resource areas as well, but we've added a couple of new limited projects that will be applying here, and for land subject to coastal storm flowage, but also in the other coastal regs. And then finally, we have some provisions about nature-based shoreline protection that will apply generally and are quite important. Next slide. Okay, so this is the provision that sort of covers the question of what performance standards apply. You'll find it at 310 CMR 10.364. And again, the basic rule is that where land subject coastal storm flowage overlaps another resource area, you apply the performance standards for that other resource area, except, and they're important standards, and you can see these first two that go to the elevation of buildings and the height of buildings, and importantly, a prohibition on new buildings in the velocity zone, even on open piles. And then within the moderate wave action area, buildings have to be elevated under the building code for the other resource area, dune or barrier beach, and or under these standards, whichever is higher. So those, it's a height requirement standard, that elevation standard that applies generally, even if that there is an overlapping resource, not second resource area involved. And then three other circumstances. There's a particular provision about coastal bank. You can find it at 10.37, that circumstance where coastal bank doesn't supply sediment, and there in that circumstance is the land subject coastal storm flowage performance standards also will apply. The same with anywhere within a rocky intertidal shore. Both standards apply. And then finally, the standards do not apply to maritime industrial uses within a designated port area. Next slide. Okay, so the regulations are set up in a consistent way with the other coastal resource areas and the inland ones too, beginning with, but of course these are specific to land subject to coastal storm flowage, beginning with a preamble that explains the functions and characteristics of this area, the effects of development, and Jill did an excellent overview of those, what's involved with that, the characteristics of land subject to coastal storm flowage, and then the presumption of significance to flood control and storm damage prevention. And it's the significance is per se to within the velocity zone and the moderate wave action zone. Again, that's the areas with extensive wave energy and where the impacts are greatest. There is a definition section in this at 10.36, which again is our new portion of the regulations for this resource area. And there's some terms that are only used there, so we've added some in. It's important to note that there are terms that are used which are also defined in the general definition section at the beginning of the regulations, and also in the beginning of the coastal regulations. So you may need to look in more than one place to find a definition. Moving now to boundaries, the boundary section is it goes to explains about the zones that Jill's gone over, and those zones are presumed accurate based on the flood insurance rate maps. That's where you need to be looking by FEMA. Applicants can request, it's called a letter of map revision from FEMA, not from us, but that's been granted, it will be actually added to the flood maps. But we would acknowledge that. There is a allowance for evidence to be submitted to show that the land, that the boundary should be more landward. So you can look for more detail on that in the regulations themselves. And also, as in the past, historic evidence can be used for the landward boundary of land subject to coastal storm flowage. The boundary definition out to we call it 1% annual advance. It used to be 100-year storm, but otherwise it does, and storm of record, storm surge of record. So that has remained the same as it's always been in the regulations. Just turning quickly to minor activities, there are already minor activities in the regulations. They're not in this section, they're in the jurisdiction section with other minor activities at 10.02, but there is a list of activities that can go forward without needing to apply in a minimal wave action area. So, and they're fairly, small types of projects, sheds, vista pruning, putting a vegetable garden in where there was previously a lawn, things like that. So if you're interested in what would not need to apply or have suggestions about whether or not we got that list right, we'd be happy to hear about that during the public comment period. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to be talking about new development. Redevelopment will come in a bit, but this is sites that are not previously developed. And for the velocity zone and the moderate wave action zone, both those areas, again, the areas where the wave height is greatest on top of base flood elevation, it's a no adverse effects standard. So, and there is a list of activities that can go forward, including pedestrian walkways and boating facilities, coastal engineering structure repairs, as a reference to the Title V regulations. But the important difference is that in the velocity zone, no new buildings, even on open piles, will be allowed. In the moderate wave action zone, their buildings have to be elevated with unobstructed flow above base flood elevation plus 2 feet. And there is a very limited waiver for the additional 2 feet based on topography and proximity of other buildings, but it's quite limited. So that's but where buildings will be allowed, there's some additional provisions that go to being sure that the building is set back as far as it can, and to try to have impervious, permeable surface, and so that there's as little disturbance to the vegetation on site as possible to, try to keep the resource area and preserve its flood control functions. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we're turning it this again. We're in new development or undeveloped sites, and for the minimal wave action zone. Again, this is where waves are less than 1.5 feet. And here, buildings do have to be elevated. This is also true under the building code. Have to be elevated on either piles or solid foundations. With and there is a provision that would allow the issuing authority, if there's a lot of wave action on the site and when it's close to another resource area, they can require elevation on piles. But often often the minimal wave action, they'll be on solid foundations, elevated, but on solid foundations. And then there's some other performance standards about for the minimal wave action area. Including, provisions so that there won't be redirection of flow, and there's also some language about trying to avoid where there's a circumstance with a confined basin or other topographic feature that's gonna hold flood water, to be sure that its water is not routed there. Any kind of circumstances where there would be an impediment to return flow. Stormwater management, and then increasing, trying to increase permeability. Those are the important things. And again, avoiding fill is where structures would redirect flow or increase flooding. That's another one as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, turning now to redevelopment. Again, this will apply, probably fairly commonly, just because of the amount of development in land subject to coastal storm flowage. The standard here is improve existing conditions, and by redevelopment is just areas where the redevelopment would be replacement, rehabilitation, or expansion of existing structures. They're quite, in a previous developed site would be a site with structures and fill and pavement and impediments to flow. So it's quite similar to the redevelopment provisions that we have for the riverfront area, and there are different requirements here depending on whether or not it's in the V zone, which are tighter standards for that versus in the moderate wave action zone. Importantly, there's an exemption for historic structures. There are additional requirements for being sure there's stormwater management. And then also in the redevelopment section, in areas where impervious surfaces have predominantly replaced natural floodplain functions, there are two provisions that would allow structural flood control. One is for the minimum wave action zone, where there's a provision that would allow placement of fill for flood control, where they were thinking berms. And then for the velocity zone or the moderate wave action zone, there's a provision that would allow elevation of existing seawalls or construction of berms for flood control. And we have a provision there that it should be conducted or supported by a public agency. The reason why we have that is just to, flood control and seawalls is a kind of collective action problem. You do have to make sure that you don't have gaps. So we wanted to be sure that it was a part of a coherent plan around flood control. And for both circumstances, there's a provision to be sure that wave energy or flood waters don't affect other properties. Next slide. Okay, just two final things on this for land subject to coastal storm flowage. There is a provision about salt marsh and dune migration, and the purpose of this provision is to allow a landowner to do work that would support salt marsh or dune migration onto their land subject to coastal storm flowage. So it could be within the buffer zone of those areas. We want to be sure that there's no adverse impact on those areas or for neighboring properties because of this work. But again, it could be a passive or assisted migration, depending on what the landowner wants to do. But it just seemed like there was an opportunity to encourage this kind of work. And if the property owners think about it, they probably will be better off having a dune or some salt marsh because of the buffering capacities that they offer, rather than just open lawn or other things they might be doing with their land subject to coastal storm flowage. They get more protection of structures through salt marsh or dune. And then finally, there's a provision for protection of rare species, which is the same as in the other coastal resource areas. Okay, next slide.
Hey, Pam, need to do a time check, maybe 3 more minutes.
Okay, yes, I'll be very quick here. This is quite important. There is a general provision, this is added at 10.24, that that would does provide, it prioritizes nature-based shoreline protection. So it really establishes as a foundational principle that we want to use nature-based shoreline protection wherever possible. I've quoted here the first sentence of this provision. Again, it's in the general provisions for the coastal resource areas. And what's important here is that the plan be based on the characteristics of the site. So you can't really, you do have to consider what's going to work so it'll be effective. So we have some specific characteristics that landowners should be looking at. And then there's some other provisions around in the regulations that allow conversion of a resource to another resource, and it's also cites to resilientmass.org as a place to look for current mapping about shoreline change and sea level rise. So again, to make these things effective going into the future. And this is really important to use the capacity of the resource areas that we have to provide flood control and storm damage protection for shoreline property owners. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are available generally, these new provisions in the limited projects. These are areas where the limited projects are categories where you can do work notwithstanding the performance standards at the discretion of the issuing authority, the Conservation Commission or DEP. We have a couple here. One is a provision about road elevation that's coming up fairly frequently for municipal vulnerability planning. So there's a provision for those of you who are interested in road widening. You want to take a look at that. There's a revision to an existing provision we have about roads. And then we have a new provision that goes to road public and also public transportation relocation. And also importantly, a provision that in the same location that would allow water dependent use projects to be relocated or reconfigured to deal with situations where they're at risk. And again, that's coming up quite frequently with, for example, town beach facilities and things like that. But it could be a water dependent business. Many types of facilities fall into that water dependent use category. Okay, next slide. Okay, last but not least, we have a pathway for research on climate resilience. There was an interest by the scientific community about a provision that would allow this work to go forward and have a particular regulatory pathway for it. So we did establish this. Those of you who are interested in it, doing scientific research, you should take a look at it. There's a fair amount of detail in it, and it has limitations on the scope of impacts and the duration and requirements for the ability to do restoration if things aren't working out as planned. These are provisions that are in the early part of the regulations at 10.05, so you'll find them there. Okay, that's the end of my session. Next slide.
Thank you, Pam. So just a quick update on the schedule. As you know, we published these proposed regulations on December 22nd. We have one more info session on January 23rd at 1 o'clock. And then we have 3 public hearings scheduled for January 31st and February 1st, where we will just take public comments. The public comments are due on March 1st. So we want to provide enough time for people to look through everything. Next slide. And then this just summarizes how you would comment formally. Your written comments are important. So we encourage that you provide them in writing before the end of the comment period. And now we have just about 22 minutes to answer questions that you might have either in the chat or you could raise your hands and and we will do our best to provide answers. I see, okay, let me see if I want to make sure I'm getting these in the right order. I don't see the numbered hands, so I guess I'll just go by the ones I see, and then
sorry, Lisa, I didn't realize I was muted. If you look at the participants list, the order is there. So I can call them out if you'd like. There's 4 hands raised so far in this order. Sheng, John Walkie, John York, and Heidi Ritchie. And could folks please remind us of your affiliation when you ask your question? So Sheng is up first.
Yeah, thank you for the quick payment. It's always be good to enjoy the yesterday and today is very brief and quick, sweet. I'm affiliated with the Creative Land and Water Engineering based in Southborough, Massachusetts. It's an environmental and civil consulting service company. So I actually I read through quickly, and so my question actually probably more tied to the stormwater management part. So about the design, so I know there was a menu was kind of in review for a while. So I don't know if there's any updates on the stormwater application related to the inland. I know the coastal, we need to use the predicted 2070, that kind of sea level rise. So for the inland, what is anything kind of similar to that, or about the precipitation and the design storm?
yes, so thank you for that question. We will be providing a presentation on the stormwater standards at starting at 7. So if you want, but yes, we are proposing to update the precipitation data that we rely on in the stormwater standards. And we're proposing to use the NOAA 14 Atlas, the higher end of the NOAA 14 Atlas, and we'll be discussing that just in a few minutes from now.
Yeah, it might be best to postpone until we get to that, Sheng, if you can hang on, because we have a whole presentation about that coming up. And
okay.
I think several of the hands here have to do with coastal.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, great.
So we've got John Walkie next.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, John Walkie with Green Roots, live in East Boston, work in East Boston and Chelsea, and was yesterday enjoyed watching the similar presentation on the resilience regulation changes on Chapter 91. And hopefully this isn't too obtuse a question, but in that we talked quite a bit about the Resilient Mass website and the sort of forecasts, forecasting out 70 years, looking at sea level rise and what the change and the sort of storm surge would look like and the impacts on that on Chapter 91. And with this, I'm trying to understand where some of the different scenarios of sea level rise are in this. I'm assuming when we're talking about the MIWA and MOWA and all of these acronyms, it's baked into where those zones are now going to be defined, or are we using those zones as they are defined today? I'm trying to understand where the climate change forecasts are incorporated into this.
Okay, thank you for that question, John. The land subject to coastal storm flowage standards are based on the existing FEMA maps. So they do not take into account sea level rise, although we do encourage people to go to the Resilient Mass website and utilize the information that's there for planning. The FEMA maps currently have the information that's really critical for regulating the development in land subject to coastal storm flowage, because it contains the delineations of the boundaries of the zones. So the V zone, the MOA zone, and the MIWA zone. We went through a number of years with FEMA trying to get those those zones delineated, and so that's really, critical for this, this current revision, to the regs, to get these standards in place.
So those zones are they reflecting our understanding of how sea level rise is going to affect where those zones are? Because presumably some of these areas of wave run up are going to be further and further inland over time. And as resilient mass is updating and incorporating new forecasts, is there going to be sort of a cascading effect of updating these zone definitions, or is that contingent upon FEMA and firm maps being updated as well?
If FEMA maps were updated, since our standards are based on them, that would be incorporated automatically. But MassDEP is looking at the current tools that are out there, like the Mass Coastal Flood Risk Model, to try to think about the future. But at the moment, this is the necessary, first step in trying to get, some kind of standards in place in the coastal floodplain.
Okay, thank you.
Who's next? John York?
John York.
Okay, John.
Yes, thank you. My question might get deferred to the part where you deferred the first question to. It's really about details of the standards for sea levels and different levels of sea levels. But there's part of it, I'll ask it now and you can just tell me if it's deferred or take whatever you want of it. So when we're talking about sea level rise, the current datum for sea level that's regulatory used is 35 years old. It's the average of what sea level was 35 years ago. That's a third of a century. Just because of the way the real-time data has panned out, we're basically a foot higher than that now on southeastern Massachusetts. I live on town of Bourne. So this causes problems when you start dealing with things like boundaries of salt marshes and such. And when you were talking about projects and encouraging the projects to use natural methods instead of engineered structures in that area right down near the intertidal zone. So the standards don't match what's actually out there. And the reason is there's a 20-year cycle, a 20-year averaging period, and then there's about 5 years of regulatory proposals before that averaging period gets adopted. So when you start at the beginning of using that, you're 15 years after when the average was taken, but then that doesn't get updated for another 20 years. And we're at the end of that now, which is at 35 years past when the average was taken. So the new ones will be coming online in 2025. And those, when they come online, will already be 15 years old. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and it's a problem for local conservation commissions. And if there's something you can do to recognize that, this gets back to how do you actually account for sea level rise? Well, sea level rise isn't out in the future. We have 35 years of sea level rise since our norm was set. That's the question.
That's a good question, and I appreciate it. And I'm gonna tap like Jill, or also we have a specialist who's been working with us, Rebecca Haney from MassCZM, if you want to add after I respond. But we encourage people to use the updated information that is on the Resilient Mass website, including the MCFRM. We think with the Mass Coastal Flood Risk Model, we think it is prudent, for people who live in these areas that are subject to risk of flooding and storm damage. For regulatory reasons, we needed to use the FEMA maps because they are thoroughly vetted maps They contain the information on the flood zones that we need to do the regulations. And we are looking, at the future, as to what the next steps might be. But for this set of regulations, it's based on the FEMA maps with a recommendation that people, go and use this other information that's out there for planning.
Thank you. So along with that is just one other observation.
John,
Okay,
I
yep.
just want to beg your indulgence. There are
Yeah.
many people here with hands up. So, and
Yeah.
your question is important. I'm sure it's on everybody's mind. So maybe just
Great. Very good.
Go
Thank
ahead
you.
and ask your follow-up, and then we'll.
So it's not a question, it's just an observation. There are no tide stations in Buzzards Bay. It's a pretty big body of water, has its own tidal dynamics. There are no tide stations that are used for any of these regulatory purposes. It's all extrapolated from tide stations that are 30 or 40 miles away. That's just another issue. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's
Thank
much
you, John.
appreciated. Who's next? Heidi or Julia?
Heidi Ritchie is next.
Heidi. Hi, Heidi.
Hi, Lisa. Hi, Stephanie. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all this work, and it's so important to update these regulations to the extent you can now. And then I know you're accepting comments on potential future updates, and meanwhile, the state's getting the Resilient Coast Initiative underway. My question is in the chat. So the regulations as drafted have two presumptions of significance for storm damage and flood control. And I know those can be any presumptions under the regulations. There are provisions for overcoming presumptions. Is there any ability of a conservation commission to accept documentation that a particular location is also significant to other of the 8 interests?
Yeah, Heidi, I admit I actually quickly looked this up, and there is a provision in the regulations right now at 10.05 that goes for presumption of significance, and it appears to say that that they can be rebutted. It does not give any indication that the issuing authority can determine that there are additional interests. So I think I would just sort of leave it from that. I think it may be a good comment if you think we should have included other interests. We did add for the riverfront area that you could partially rebut the presumptions, but because because riverfront areas are so different, and there we listed all of them. But I take your point. I gather there is a prevention of pollution was the thing that was the interest that you had in mind.
Well, that was one, but there may well be others as well.
Yeah,
These areas may be significant to protection of fisheries and shell fisheries or wildlife habitat or the other interests, depending on the specific site characteristics.
Yeah,
not all are. So I'll put that in the comments, but I was just I wanted to make sure that I understood how the regulations work and whether there even is the ability of a conservation commission to say, well, in addition to the presumed significance in this particular location, we have this evidence that, in this particular case, it is also significant to these other interests.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I don't think that's come up actually before, but anyway, it's a good point. Send in a comment.
Thank you.
Definitely. All right. I think I see one more hand, which is Julia Godfreyson. Hey, Julia.
Hi, thank you. So I have 2 quick questions. I hope that they're quick. The
Julia,
first
what's
is,
your affiliation?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm with the Newburyport Conservation Commission. I'm the administrator.
Thank you.
And the first is with regard to redevelopment in highly developed areas. You mentioned that in one of the slides, and I'm just wondering, we have some pretty developed areas on our waterfront. What is there going to be a definition for highly developed area that we can use to rely on?
Okay. Yes, we actually spent quite a bit of time ourselves on that very point. And in the regulations, what it says is that those are it applies in areas where the impervious surface is predominantly have replaced the natural floodplain. So obviously there's some room for interpretation there, but we wanted it to apply again in downtown areas. That's really what we were thinking would be the kind of situation where to apply, where you just stand there along the the shoreline and you see pavement and roads and buildings, and so it's and the natural floodplain is that those functions are largely gone.
Okay.
They're
So
never
it's
gone entirely, or they may be replaced by whatever is going on between the buildings, but
right.
it is highly developed areas is sort of a short form for it, but yeah.
Okay, that'll be interesting
Sure.
to try and implement that one, but we'll see. And then so the next question is, you mentioned on another slide that the issuing authority may require natural shoreline restoration or stabilization as an alternative to coastal engineering structures.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to imagine a situation in which we get an application where a homeowner, and given the situations that we sometimes are in with people on the coast, they want a coastal engineering structure, or they want to replace or repair a coastal engineering structure to protect their property. And if we were to suggest that they don't do that, but as an alternative do a natural sort of green infrastructure, I'm wondering, obviously be case by case basis, but would there be, if the situation was correct for that kind of suggestion or recommendation, would there be technical assistance available to conservation commissions? Because I'm assuming that the first response from the applicant would be, well, what do you want me to do?
Yeah. I think there is a little more detail in the regulations on this, and it's really important that I think I mentioned this, that the site, the characteristics of the site are taken into account, and thinking through, what's going to be effective. So we looked there to some good work that had been done by the Northeast Regional Ocean Council, and they had some factors, including tidal range, bathymetry, intertidal slope, wave energy, things like that. And those can help guide you and trying to figure out whether or not there's a effective alternative. There won't be at all sites, but I think in many there will be. So and I think we are developing more guidance on this topic.
Okay, thank
So
you. That would be
should
really
help
helpful.
you. Yeah.
All right, and I imagine, Julia, you're probably very familiar with the online resources. Like Coastal Zone Management has quite a bit of online resources available, and we have the circuit riders.
Yeah, I just don't want to be in a situation where then an applicant is looking to the conservation commissioners and myself to design them a green infrastructure project where they would otherwise then have to ditch their plan of just doing what would be their first inclination and hiring different types of consultants, and it's the implementation of that piece to me sounds great, but kind of complicated.
Yeah, it's not intended to put the burden on the issuing authority to design another project for them. It's just a question of whether or not, if you think that there's some alternative that doesn't involve hard structures, it's going to work. It's just better to use it, because the hard structures are not going to move with sea level rise.
Oh,
start compounding your problem. So that's really. But again, we will be making revisions to the coastal manual. It doesn't have anything about it says it does have some text in it now about landslide coastal storm flowage, but there will be revisions to that provide more guidance on this.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. I see William Manuel.
That's right. Hi, Bill Manuel from Wetlands and Land Management in Danvers, and I'm just thinking about my little sphere of the world, which might include the northern end of Plum Island or Salisbury, which the barrier beach there is largely mapped as a velocity zone. And I've seen in the draft regulations, and tonight it says no new buildings in the V zone. Would that preclude a person redeveloping their lot and removing the structure entirely and rebuilding it?
In that circumstance, it would be the project would be governed by the redevelopment standards if it's already been developed. And there's some, you'd have to look carefully about considering the site and the building and the circumstances under which would be redeveloped, but it wouldn't be prohibited, but there'd be some limitations on or specifics about how the project would be governed under the new regulations.
Right, there's not closer to the water and
Yeah,
no
yeah.
larger footprint. Obviously, when you redevelop something, a lot of times where a building may jig, the revised footprint jogs a little bit. I mean, is it a square footage basis? Is it actual footprint that you're going to be looking at?
Pam, he's asking about Barrier Beach.
No, more so in the velocity zone.
But
Rebecca,
just because
Rebecca, do you
these
wanna-
regs don't overlap with the other resource areas, I think that's an important point to point out.
Okay, but he is talking about the building and the elevation of the building, so,
Right,
Yeah.
and just in the Barrier Beach, so.
Yeah.
right,
Yeah,
so
here-
what Rebecca, our coastal zone, we are very fortunate to have coastal zone management here assisting us. As we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, if you're in another resource area, you would follow the standards of the other resource area and not the LSCSF standards, except for elevation requirements that are listed in 310 CMR 10.364.
yeah.
Those are
But
the
it also-
exceptions to that
Yeah.
rule.
Yeah, but that section does point to the redevelopment standards for elevation of the velocity zone, so, yeah.
So you will find the answers, William, sorry, I don't know if you're Bill, but in the redevelopment standards of LSCSF, which is like 10.368,
Yes,
or in the Barrier Beach standards, which are in the wetlands regulations as well. Hopefully that's helpful. Are we done with coastal questions? Because we're ready to move on to stormwater.
Yeah, there's no more hands for now. And as you're getting ready to transition, two things occur to me. One is something came up in our earlier session today, and I just wanted to say out loud in case we forget to mention it, that these are draft regulations. And so once we go through the public comment process and then eventually get to, hopefully not in the too distant future, executing these, enacting these regulations, we will have an extensive outreach and training process with Concoms, and we'll be, collaborating with both MACC and MSMCP, the Association of Agents and Conservation Commissions. So we certainly don't expect anybody to walk in cold and know exactly how to apply these things. So there will be extensive training.
And also a simplified guide for conservation commissions. So we are going to be putting that out shortly after these are promulgated. Okay, so let's move on to stormwater. And just like the coastal, we have about 25 minutes presentation, and then we'll spend the rest of the time with stormwater questions, or if you still have coastal questions, you can ask them then. I want to introduce the team stormwater, which includes Tom McGuire and Elizabeth Clark, both from MassDEP, stormwater experts. And also our special guest, Dave Roman from Comprehensive Environmental, Inc., who helped us put together the updated stormwater handbook draft that is currently posted online, and we are accepting comments on that as well. So it's in the same area on the web as the proposed regulations. Next slide. So the agenda for this next presentation is, I'm going to give a high level overview of stormwater standards 2, 3, 4, and 7, since those are the standards that are going to have the most change in the new regulations. Then we're going to do a bit of a detailed, dive on those 4 standards to just go into a little bit more detail. After that, we'll go give you an overview of the proposed new standard 11, and that's for total maximum daily loads. And then we'll give you an overview of some new environmentally sensitive site design credits that have been developed that are all presented in the Stormwater Handbook. And finally, a preview of the draft Stormwater Handbook. And then we'll have hopefully about 30 minutes left for questions and answers after that. Next slide. Okay, so I just want to give you a little summary of why, what the goals of the Stormwater Management Update are or were when we were developing it. And first and foremost is to update the outdated precipitation data that we rely on in designing the stormwater management systems with current data that reflects increasing storms. The second goal was to align with EPA's MS4 general permit to the best extent that we can. Third is to promote nature-based environmentally sensitive site design. And then finally, we badly need to update our stormwater handbook, which at this point is about 15 years old. So it's definitely in need of an update. So those are the main goals of the stormwater update. These are, next slide, Dave. These are the stormwater standards. If you're familiar with them, there's currently 10. And the ones that are highlighted in blue are the main ones that are going to change, and we'll be discussing those today. The first standard 2 is for peak discharge rates. Standard 3 is for groundwater recharge. Standard 4 is pollutant removal for new development. And then standard 7 is for redevelopment. And we are proposing a new standard to improve protection of waters that currently are assigned a designation of total maximum daily load or impaired waters. Next slide, Dave. Okay, so starting with standard 2, the standard 2 is the peak is for peak runoff attenuation, and the standard basically requires that post-development peak discharge rates do not exceed pre-development discharge rates. And currently, this standard is based on precipitation data that is 60 years old. It's from a very outdated document referred to as Technical Paper 40, and it badly needs to be updated. And so the key proposal for this standard is to discontinue use of the TP40, the 60-year-old data, and adopt the new NOAA 14 Atlas precipitation data. And except for rather than adopting the fitted value from the NOAA Atlas or the average value, we are proposing to adopt the 90% of the published upper confidence interval would be the data that you use to design for peak for this standard, and that we refer to as NOAA Plus. So NOAA Plus is the 90% of the published upper confidence interval in the NOAA Precipitation Atlas. We are also proposing to require design for the 2, 10, and 100-year storm events. For redevelopment for this standard, the current standard for redevelopment is maximum extent practicable, and we are proposing to keep it as a maximum extent practicable standard for redevelopment, except that it would be maximum extent practicable of NOAA Plus, the NOAA Plus precipitation data. Next slide, Dave. For stormwater standard 3, and that's the recharge standard, which basically requires that annual recharge from the post-development site shall approximate annual recharge from the pre-development site based on soil type. So the current recharge standard has soil recharge standards for each soil, A through D. And the proposed requirement for new development is that A, B, and C soils must recharge 1 inch if you're using the static method. And for D soils, it would be 1 inch to the maximum extent practicable. And additional methods are allowed to be used for the recharge standard, such as the dynamic standard and dynamic method and the continuous simulation method. And those, if using those methods, they would be presumed to meet the standard of the 1 inch using the static method. For redevelopment for the recharge standard, we are proposing to keep that as a maximum extent practicable standard, only it would be maximum extent practicable of 1 inch of recharge, except for D soils. And we're also proposing to allow offsite mitigation for redevelopment for the recharge standard. Next slide, Dave. Now for standard 4, this is the pollutant removal standard, and this is the one that was most important to try to align with EPA to the extent possible, so that the two, requirements are, similar. The current standard for pollutant removal is to remove 80% of the annual load of total suspended solids. And the proposal is to align with the EPA general permit, the MS4 general permit, by requiring removal of 90% total suspended solids and 60% total phosphorus for new development. And offsite, different from EPA, offsite mitigation would not be allowed, since the assumption is you're starting from a new site which could be designed to accommodate the stormwater requirement. For redevelopment, we are also proposing to align with EPA and require removal of 80% total suspended solids and 50% total phosphorus. And although this standard is for redevelopment is currently at maximum extent practicable, we are proposing to change that and require that most projects fully meet this standard, the pollutant removal standard, and we'll discuss the reasons for that in a few minutes. We are also proposing to allow offsite mitigation for redevelopment for the standard. And all of the exceptions that are currently in the stormwater handbook will remain. And we've added a couple of new exceptions as well to the fully meets standard for redevelopment. But most projects would have to meet that standard. That's the proposal. Next slide. I'm now going to turn this over. We're going to go into a little bit of a deeper dive on these standards I just talked about. I'm going to turn it over to Tom McGuire to talk about the NOAA Plus component of the peak rate attenuation standard. Tom, you ready?
Yes, as Lisa indicated, we currently rely on TP40 or Technical Paper 40. Just to give you an idea, it was put together by something called the U.S. Weather Bureau, the predecessor agency to the National Weather Service. That's how old it is. It's paper. There's about 2 or 3 ISO heights, which are sort of lines of equal precipitation in Massachusetts, so it's very coarse. We're proposing to replace it with a variation of NOAA 14, which is a web-based interface. You can get precipitation statistics for any point in space in Massachusetts, so it's much more reliable in terms of interpolating between stations. We're proposing to use the upper end, though, the upper confidence, rather than just rely on the fitted value as Lisa indicated. Next slide. This is an example of how one would get NOAA 14 when one clicks on a point in space, let's say Worcester, Massachusetts. it comes up with it. You get a table. The dark value is the fitted value, and the two values below that in parentheses are the lower confidence to the upper confidence. What we're seeing here is a lot of the storms are toward the upper end versus the fitted value. So, but we're proposing to take the upper value, which is 10.7 in this case, you'd multiply it by 0.9, which is a 10% reduction to that value. And that's the value you'd use for design, not the 7.88. So this reflects the range of current storms we're seeing that are higher than the NOAA values. Next slide, please. We're also proposing to make the same change in borderlands subject to flooding. Right now, we rely on the FEMA mapping, and then in the absence of the FEMA flood profile, we rely on the largest event observed or recorded, and then an engineering analysis in the event of a conflict, relying on a 7-inch storm in 24 hours. So we're proposing to keep everything the same, rely on the FEMA mapping, rely on the largest event observed or recorded, and then the conflict, instead of using the 7-inch storm in 24 hours, we'd rely on the NOAA plus storm. Turn it over to Dave Roman now.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So now we'll go into standard 3 and talk about stormwater recharge. So as Lisa mentioned, the current standard, the recharge depth is based on hydrologic soil groups. So for example, for the static method, the recharge depth would be 0.6 inches for soil group A, 0.1 inches for soil group D. The proposed recharge depth is now 1 inch for all soil groups, except for D, which would be to the maximum extent practicable. There are some dynamic methods that can be used to reduce this recharge depth. So dynamic sizing can result in smaller SCMs than static sizing because it takes into account the saturated hydraulic conductivity. So the current handbook allows 2 different dynamic methods. These are the simple dynamic method and the dynamic field method. There is a proposed new method called the continuous simulation method. And this is a spreadsheet-based method which looks at long-term rainfall records and is used to size the recharge dynamically. One thing to note is that MassDEP did look at this 1-inch target recharge value based on some questions from the advisory committee. And as a result of that, a couple of different analyses were looked at. One was the base flow separation analysis, and one was the continuous rainfall simulation. And really, the whole entire goal of this is to look and see how a recharge target can be set to mimic pre-development recharge values. So based on this result, DEP is considering to change this recommendation from 1 inch to 0.8 inches and seeking comments on the results of these. So there's a notice to reviewers document posted on the website with kind of more information, and you can also find those 2 analyses. And I'll pass it over to Liz to talk about standard 4 and pollutant removal.
Thanks, Dave. I am Liz Clark. I'm going to walk you through the changes to Standard 4 and the new Standard 11. Standard 4 was changed with 2 main goals in mind. One, to improve the water quality from the stormwater runoff coming off of our post-developed, new developed and redeveloped sites. In the past 4 to 5 years, we've seen an additional 224 water bodies in the Commonwealth be designated as impaired due to pollutants that are commonly found in stormwater runoff. And additionally, as Lisa mentioned, the other goal is to align to the extent possible with the 2016 small MS4 permit. Currently, about 74% of the communities in Massachusetts are subject to the permit, and the post-developed stormwater management requirements exceed the 2008 stormwater handbook. Next slide. So what has changed? The current standard is requires 80% TSS removal or total suspended solids removal for new development, and on redevelopment to meet the 80% TSS removal to the maximum extent practicable. We are increasing that standard, and for new development, we're going to a 90% TSS removal, and we're adding in a 60% average annual load reduction of total phosphorus. For redevelopment, these standards are moving from a maximum extent practicable standard to now a fully meets. So we're going to 80% TSS removal and 50% total phosphorus removal for redevelopment projects. There is a provision for offsite mitigation in the event that these standards can't be met for on-site for redevelopment projects that do not discharge to a critical area and that are not designated as land use to higher pollution prevent as a level. When you do evaluate your offsite mitigation, you're going to start kind of close to your site and then gradually expand out to the maximum of a HUC 12 or a hydrologic unit code. And those HUC 12 watersheds are available on MassMapper if you wanted to see them. Next slide. So for the redevelopment standards, we still do have exemptions. These align largely with the 2008 Stormwater Handbook. So single family projects that are less than 4 units or lots that do not discharge to a critical area are exempt, as well as emergency repairs and gardens with no impervious surfaces have been added. There are a few categories of projects that can still comply to the maximum extent practicable. Those are projects with 4 residential units or lots that discharge to a critical area or less, 5 to 9 residential units or lots that discharge to a critical area, unpaved paths such as footpaths or multi-use paths, bicycle paths, anything that's not subject to vehicle access, marinas, boatyards, and roadway maintenance. Next slide. So complying with the standard, there are 3 options listed in the revised handbook. The first is utilizing environmental sensitive site design credits, and we'll go over those in just a minute. There are 7 available. In the event that you cannot use those, you'd be moving to options 2 and 3. We have the EPA performance curves now included in Appendix B of the draft Stormwater Handbook. These were included in the current MS4 permit in Appendix F, so I think a lot of you may be familiar with them. And then there's also, in the event that there isn't a performance curve, we can move to the MassDEP pollutant removal credits, such as getting 25% TSS removal for a catch basin. And there is a table 2-2 in the handbook that has a crosswalk that's going to show you which methodology you can use for the sizing. Next slide. So this is an example of the EPA performance curves. Again, these are all included in Appendix B. The dark blue line shown on the screen is our total suspended solids removal. The darker orange one here is our total phosphorus. And on our vertical axis, you see the pollutant load reduction by percentage. And on the horizontal, that is the depth of runoff across the impervious area that is treated by the stormwater control measure. So when you see the 0.4, that's 0.4 inches of runoff across the impervious area. So there's 2 different ways you can look at sizing with these curves. The first is really just meeting that standard 4, which is shown in blue here, where you're targeting the 90% TSS and the 60% total phosphorus. And you can see if we did that sizing with this stormwater control measure, we're treating 0.4 inches of runoff across the impervious area. You can also evaluate it to meet that 1-inch recharge standard, or if you have a critical area or a level when you're trying to target that 1-inch water quality volume. And by doing that, you can see that our treatment rates go way up, where we're almost getting 100% of the total suspended solids and in excess of 90% on the total phosphorus. These curves also really show where you get your highest and best efficiencies, your most bang for your buck as well. Next slide. So now pivoting to Standard 11. Standard 11 was also developed with the intent to protect the waters of the Commonwealth, and it applies to projects that have TMDLs that are either for nutrients, so phosphorus and nitrogen, for pathogens, which would include your fecal indicator bacteria, your fecal coliforms, your E. coli's, or your metals, zinc, cadmium, lead, aluminum, and iron. The North Coastal Mercury TMDL does not apply in this case. So to comply with this standard, you're going to comply with standards 3 and 4, and you're going to use specific stormwater control measures to address the applicable TMDL. And you're also going to tailor your long-term pollution prevention plan to address the pollutants of concern. So if you had a nutrient TMDL that you were addressing, you would have a nutrient management plan in your long-term pollution prevention plan. Next slide. So references, just to see, so you know if Standard 11 applies, we did develop a map that shows the TMDLs, and the link is here. And again, these slides will be posted later on. Additionally, this information can be found on MassMapper as well. Next slide. And there is a table, table 2-6, included in the handbook, and this tells you which stormwater control measures are appropriate for which pollutant of concern. So you can see up in the top in gray, we have our pollutants of concern, TSS, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, fecal indicator bacteria, and metals. And then going down the list, it gives you a pretty clear yes or no, or in some cases, it varies if the SCM applies. With that, I'll turn it back over to Dave.
All right, thanks, Liz. So we're almost done here, getting down to the home stretch. So there is a new requirement in the proposed regulations that environmentally sensitive site design, or ESSD, and LID techniques must be used to attenuate stormwater pollutants. So the idea here is that there have been several ESSD credits that have been built to kind of help meet this requirement. So this requirement, would be used for sizing SCMs, for example, to meet the recharge standard or the pollutant removal standard. So the 2008 handbook has a couple of credits. It has 3 LID credits. We've just renamed those to ESSD. So those credits were updated, and then we've also added some to help applicants meet this new ESSD requirement. So essentially, those 3 credits that were in the handbook, the minimum criteria for those was updated to make implementation of those a bit easier. There are also 4 new ESSD credits that I'll go over on the next slide. And then the list of MassDEP recognized ESSD and LID techniques has been expanded. So this table here is just showing the 7 ESSD credits. So the first one is in the 2008 handbook, and this is really just general ESSD to minimize impervious surface on sites. This has been updated, so there's some new criteria for this. There's a new credit for solar projects. Credits 3 and 4 are in the 2008 handbook. This is disconnection of impervious surface to qualifying pervious areas, such as like a meadow, for example. Those have been updated. There's a new credit to encourage the use of tree canopies. So the idea here is that if a tree canopy overhangs over the impervious surface, you can run some calculations and deduct the effective impervious area from the calculation needed to meet recharge and pollutant removals. There's a new credit for redevelopment only that encourages the use of reductions with impervious area. And then finally, credit 7 is to protect or enhance buffer areas. So really to encourage the use of buffers. This could be new buffers or it could be existing buffers. Now we'll quickly just go over the revised handbook. So this table here is showing the structure of the 2008 handbook versus the proposed revised handbook structure. So the 2008 handbook was set up into 3 different volumes. The revised handbook is just all one document. It's organized essentially the same. So essentially the chapters kind of follow the volume. So the same general flow to it, but it's all one document. And the appendices are at the end. So just looking into the handbook, some key things that have changed on the handbook. It's got a new cover page. There's a table of contents. There's searchable headings, figures, and tables. So essentially live links to help find things quickly. We tried to add pop-up boxes for key information, so like what is a stormwater control measure, for example. Calculation boxes have been standardized. So just to try to really, for various calculations, it's all kind of in the same format, step by step. There are summary tables to help find various information. And just the overall handbook has been kind of reformatted. So the handbook, there's also some content that's been updated, and this content is essentially to follow some of the major changes or the proposed changes to the regulations. So a couple of the big changes here are updating how the rainfall depths are calculated, from TP 40 to NOAA Atlas 14. There is information on how to use the performance curves. There are the new ESSD fact sheets and credits. There's a whole whole section on the new TMDL standard 11, and just a couple other things. There are sections about the alternative analysis framework. So essentially, how to use that for various requirements. There is a section on offsite mitigation for redevelopment projects. Also, just expanded some of the information on various required plans, like the construction plan, the long-term pollution plan, and the O&M plans. There's a master setback table that's been added, so essentially trying to put all the setbacks into one place. Also, just a chapter for solar projects and highways. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Thanks very much, Dave. Okay, so the schedule's just shown here. I wanted to briefly go over it. As you know, or as you might know, the regulation proposal was posted for public comment on December 22nd of 2023. We have one more public information session on Tuesday, January 23rd. We'll cover the same information, and we'll have additional questions and answers. So we encourage you to attend if you still have questions after today. And then there are 3 public hearings where we'll be taking comments. And those are on January 31st and February 1st. Next slide, Dave. The how you actually provide written comments. The comment period ends on March 1st of 2024. And on the slide, I'll just leave this up so you can see, the official ways that you can submit your written comments. We encourage you to do so, because just commenting here today isn't enough. You really would need to put your comments, or we encourage you to put your comments in writing and submitting them officially. And with that, we have done our job to leave 28 minutes for questions and answers. So, and I see a hand, so I'm encouraged by that. And I don't know if there's more than one hand, but
one at the moment.
Okay, so Deshang, would you like to? Now this is your chance.
Yeah, thank you for Tom, and so it's good to see some good progress in the stormwater management handbooks, and so the water quality volume related to pollution removal rate. That's definitely a one very positive. I have been doing that since the first version, so applying, but nobody accepted. They all fall back to the handbook, cookie cutter rate. So I finally see this, merit-based stormwater quality treatment volume, proportionally based TSS and the TP removal. I was just wondering, there's no other. It's actually have some heavy metals, including lead and other things also associated with that treatment. So it seems like it was not. But we can discuss that later. So I have probably three specific questions. So one is this stormwater regulations, I assume, will become like a formal published at the same time as the 310 CMR regulations expected.
Yes, the stormwater standards are part of the Wetlands Protection Act regulations. So the stormwater standards are in 310 CMR 10, and they are also in the water quality certification regulations, pretty much the same standards, 314 CMR 9.
Oh,
and
yeah, just confirm
so,
it. That's what I thought. Thank
right.
you. So yeah,
And so the
just to save you some
handbook,
time.
yeah, so the stormwater handbook would be updated at the same time. And that is available for public comment as well. The stormwater handbook,
I
it's on
downloaded
our
that
website. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and so the other things I haven't really heard anything mentioned too much about it is in the old. I haven't get a chance to read through the new handbook in detail, but in the old ones, Tom knows that there's design guidelines, or you can say guidelines, but it's become like a formally enforced through the mentioning in the 310 CMR 1006. The handbooks, there's lots of different design setbacks, and there's no really clear definition how those setback is measured, and it caused a tremendous fighting and in practice design, and even just like as Tom knows, just for the infiltration basin setback to wetlands, it went through a couple of interpretations. So, and then right now, there's still more, like say, infiltration basin setbacks to so-called 15 or steeper slope. And so need to be 50 feet, and there is no really guidelines or detailed guidelines in the handbook to tell people how to measure that, and to what kind of extent, because like in your embankment, you can have a 3-to-1 slope. How can you apply to a natural slope as 15%? That's very rare in the reality. So lots of slopes is exceeding 15%. That's very not practical, and it's not necessary in my view. So technically, no merits. I'm not sure if this new handbook has revisited that and have provided at least the scientific sound guidance on that. So final is not the first, is it's the standard 11 from what I'm reading it. So this
Well, just Shane, can I just jump in for a second?
Yes.
That's something we'd welcome comment on. This is really an information session for questions. The other thing you should look at as part of providing comments is we're proposing to take the setbacks out of the handbook and actually put them directly in the wetlands and in the water quality certification regulations.
Okay.
I'd also just add one more thing too, just on the setbacks. There is information about how to measure those setbacks now in the handbook. So it's in section 2.5 of the revised handbook. So there's kind of a whole section on, how to measure those. So that might be helpful to look at as well when you're.
Yes, I definitely
Shane, you probably know we've had a couple of appeals regarding how to measure those setbacks. So that's what we've incorporated into the handbook.
Okay. I definitely will like to go through that, and hopefully, I would try to make a time. The problem is right now, I mean, I have to work in 16 hours to get some time to do those kind of things, but what I can do, I think it's important. I will go. So the 11, I want to get some input. So it's like a similar to the NOAA Atlas 14 kind of thing. The DEP is going to provide some kind of web-based application. You can check in your site if that apply to your project, or if I understand right, or it's different.
Yeah, we have a map viewer. I mean, Liz can talk about this. We have a map viewer that's available online right now to find the TMDLs for each, watershed where they're adopted.
So there are 5 specific TMDLs that that this applies to, and there's one other category, I think, alternative, if there's been an alternative TMDL designated, but it's not every TMDL that might be listed in the impaired waters report. The regulation specifies 5 TMDLs, and to see if your site is discharging to a water that is designated with one of those TMDLs, that's when you would this standard 11 would apply. And so to determine whether your site might discharge to one of those TMDLs, you could go to this website and see, you could determine whether it applies to you. And if it does apply to you, then essentially your requirements are to meet standards 3 and 4 and to use certain stormwater control measures that are designated for that TMDL. And we have a table that tells you which stormwater control measures are usable for for those TMDLs. Is that clear enough? I don't know if you want to add anything, Liz.
I think you guys did a great job covering it. I think we're good.
Thank you.
Okay, is that it?
I render my time. Otherwise, people say I occupy too much time. So.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for those thoughtful. We encourage you to put your comments in writing if you have a chance to go through everything. I see Amanda. Is Amanda the next one?
Amanda Green.
Okay, Amanda Green.
How's it going?
Hi, Amanda.
Peabody Conservation Commission. And I just wanted to, I'm sure this has been thought of and everything, but for development and redevelopment that's in the works, I presume that these projects will be grandfathered into the old regs. Would that be accurate?
You mean what?
Like if we have a project come before us that's been, coming before us for 6 months and going back to the zoning board and this and that, and they're working from the old regs, are they gonna be able to keep with the old regs, or are we gonna be able to enforce the new stuff on them before?
Okay, I understand your question now. So actually, our advisory committee suggested a delayed implementation date for the stormwater standards for exactly that reason. And so the proposed standards are that from the date of promulgation, so the date that the standards become effective, the stormwater requirements would kick in 6 months after that. Okay. So 6 months, so projects filed 6 months after that would need to meet the new standards, whether it's new development or redevelopment. Anything that's in the pipeline right now, or after the regs are promulgated, will have 6 months. Okay. Now that's only for stormwater. That proposal is not in the regulation proposal for the coastal, for the other non-stormwater standards. Those would be implemented immediately.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll just add one quick thing though, Amanda, and that's, Peabody is an MS4 because it's so urbanized.
Yeah,
So you already have like an 80-50 requirement for redevelopment. So some of these standards that the city of Peabody should already be enforcing, not necessarily through the Conservation Commission, but through the building department.
interesting. Okay.
I mean, those requirements are not new. Liz can jump in with what the permit date is. I think it's 2016 for the MS4 permit.
And then I just have one other question. We're being inundated with the way they're getting development to pushing their development is with 40B applications, which it's like circumventing the system. Like if they get denied regular, they come in with the 40B. So we're getting killed. We're getting killed with this stuff. And I was just wondering if there's any, like, if these new regs, like the 40B applicants will also be able to circumvent the system and be able to build ruthlessly on our lands.
I don't think, I mean, they wouldn't be,
Yeah, they're not exempt from state requirements, so they could be exempt from local requirements, like a local bylaw.
Yeah,
But we're proposing to put, these would be state requirements to the wetland regulations. So they might not be subject to, like, let's say the Peabody Wetlands bylaw, but they would be subject to the Wetlands Protection Act.
okay. Thank you very much.
thanks, Amanda. I think Lisa Bazzuto.
Yeah, we're out in the Berkshires, and I noticed that map that you just had didn't even notice that the Berkshires were there. But as you likely know, we have a long river that has been seriously polluted over time. And we're concerned that the FEMA maps haven't been, and they've told us won't be updated.
Was the map you're referring to, is that the TMDL map?
Yes.
Flip back. Okay, so there's two separate issues, I think, here. One is the
Yes.
TMDLs and the other is the FEMA.
FEMA mapping, yes.
Yes, so the TMDL mapping is specific to the ones that have the pollutants that were mentioned, which would be your nutrients, your metals, or your fecal indicator bacterias. So this is where TMDLs have been developed. I know that there is ongoing study and assessment always on our quality of waters, and this may grow over time, but for now, this is the list.
Yeah, if I could just speak to the FEMA mapping. You know, the FEMA mapping for a lot of the cities and towns in Western Mass is from the 1970s and the 1980s. So it is out of date. If that's something you want to provide comments on for BLSF that we shouldn't rely on it anymore, you know, feel free to make that comment. We are looking at another potential, you know, source, but you know, the FEMA mapping is pretty much standard.
Things have changed, though.
I know. Believe me, I know.
And we pretty much feel neglected out here.
Well, you know, some of the maps have been updated. Like I had an appeal for Westfield a while back where that map was updated. So it really depends on where you are in Western Mass, whether or not it's been updated or not. The Berkshires are all from the 1980s, pretty much.
Westfield is an hour away.
Right, but it is part of Western Mass.
Yeah.
Tom, do you want to talk about how the maps can be rebutted, or I think you mentioned that in your slide, the BLSF slide.
What we're proposing to do, well, what we're proposing to do with BLSF is to continue to rely on the FEMA flood insurance profile. And then in the absence of a profile, the largest event observed or recorded. And then in the event of a conflict, the engineering analysis. You know, there is sort of an issue with the engineering analysis because it's more related toward ponds and not rivers. So for instance, you know, the Connecticut River, it's not really gonna work, you know, that type of solution. But it's really geared towards smaller parcels, that alternative procedure.
Okay,
You know, we have a separate project to kind of develop a statewide hydraulic model. We're applying it first to sizing culverts. The goal is in the long term that it'd be able to be used for flood studies, but that's a good ways away. And then there's another project, the Future Stream Flow Project, that our Resilient Massachusetts Action Team is working with the USGS and Tufts University and Cornell on to project future stream flows, the way the RMAC group has done with precipitation. So the plan or the thought is, if we could couple the future stream flow project with the statewide hydraulic model, it would allow mapping of these floodplains, you know, as we advance forward for climate change. But that's a while off.
right, but that project is being started out in Western Mass, so you should be.
That's right.
You might be heartened to hear that.
Yeah, the pilot basin's in Western Mass. We wanted to get a basin that was not altered that much, so it's the
Right.
Squanicook River Basin.
No, the project has started a build out in Western Mass, so they're working in actually the Westfield Basin and the
Oh, right, for the hydraulic model, right. I was
Yes.
thinking of the Future Stream Flow
Yeah.
Project, which is in the Squanicook.
right, but that's not related to these regs. So let's move on. Thank you for your comment, Lisa. We appreciate it, and please put it in writing if you feel, you know, like doing that. I see Jean Christie.
Yes. Hi, thank you for the presentation tonight. One quick question, more clarifying than anything, about standard 2. I thought I recall reading that there was potential requirements about our hydrologic modeling and what kind of programs we're using. I'm wondering if that was a requirement or if it's a methodology versus a software. Clarification.
Standard 2, we're going to continue to rely on Tier 55 in the absence of FEMA information. Well, no, so if we're talking about standard 2, so right, we're going to continue to rely on Tier 55 because the FEMA information doesn't kick in there.
So it's
if you
not
know,
a specific
like
software.
Contact, so if you use
No,
something
it's a
like Contact
methodology.
or HydroCAD, those are Tier 20 based programs. You could continue to use those, but you would need to add the updated precipitation information to them, as well as the storm distribution. I mean, we're getting type 3 storm distributions right now using the NOAA or the Cornell data, and it underestimates the amount of flow. So the storm distribution plays a role. So people shouldn't be relying on type 3 anymore if they're using Cornell or the NOAA data.
Okay, thank you.
Jean, what's your
That answers-
affiliation?
I'm a time bond.
Time bond. Yeah.
Did that
I
answer your
said-
question,
I thought you
Jean?
said I'm
It
a
did.
time
Yeah.
bomb.
Thank you.
Okay, Stephanie, we're cutting you off. All right, Deshang. I only see one hand right now, so it's Deshang.
Yeah, but are there any folks who
I have
are
a turn on, sorry.
question?
All right, Tom, I think there's a tool, that's also no details. The type 2 is the distribution curve, but actually type 2, type 1, type 3. So type 3 is the most conservative, intense distribution. As far as I understand, the NOAA is just the total precipitation. There's 2 issues.
Right, so what the NRCS has done, I mean, Dave Roman could speak to this, is they developed curves for the NOAA 14 study. They go like A, B, C, and D. And I think in Massachusetts, we're going to be relying on the B and C curves. And we have a map that's going to be available electronically, where you can just click on a site and it'll tell you if it's a B or a C distribution.
I see. So you can just take that distribution and put it in your model. That's so it used to be type 3 is the most conservative. I will be interested to plot it out to go against to see how much a difference is. Mainly the intensity in that middle 1 and 2 hour. And I just quickly browsed through your the SCM. Well, that's another term, right? It used to be say BMP. Right now, I'm have to get used to the stormwater control measures. Setbacks. I think that things I really need to write something there. I just want to make a comments here. You may want to really thinking about it. So in Massachusetts, especially in the central and west, so there's a lot of hilly side, and if you unless you don't let people develop it, I think that will be properly taken. So if the people is developing in those hilly side, and you get to let people to fit into the landscape and not to have like in your table kind of dictating the setbacks. So you can ask him for some kind of technical proving. So what is your concern? Stability, groundwater breakout. So otherwise there's no real technical merits in asking those distance. One, and second, I'm also concerned about when I was doing like a low impact development credit. So people in the handbook before, you have limited like a percentage of impervious area. So when you exceeded that, you cannot take credit. That's almost obsolete to me. Why? Because the denser you are going, the higher impervious area, the more you want to encourage people using the sensitive site design or LID. For example, you want people using like not curve the road like a country style. Why, when the impervious area they're getting high, certain height, you don't have a credit? That's oxymoron to me. So there's no logic. So I think so. Some of the things you frameworked pretty good, but it's kind of binding real creative and engineering designs. That's not good in my view. So
No, I'm just saying, provide us a comment in writing. That would be helpful for us.
yes, I will try. I will
Dave, do you
definitely
have
try.
Dave Roman, do you have any response to that?
No, I think it'd just be good to have a comment that's written up on that. That sounds helpful.
Yeah, I will definitely to follow through. I'm going to make notes because I did even just quick roll through. I just feel that those setback measurements and for the distance, regardless of natural topographic features and universally applying that kind of things is a really unscientific.
Well, we are proposing a slope setback. I mean, you might take a look at that in the proposed regs.
Yeah, I was reading your handbook, but those numbers are not realistic, practical.
I mean, the idea behind the slope setback is, let's say we have a discharge to a critical area, right? If it's a steep slope, the water is going to be running really fast. If it's a flat slope, the water is going to be slower. So the kind of like, let's say a 50-foot setback doesn't really take into account the slope of the land, right? So that's why there's a separate slope setback that's proposed.
Well, that can be engineered. So if that steep slope, if you're concerned about erosion and issues, so you can make in level spreader requirement bigger, longer perimeter. So the water can be like a sheet flow trickling out down. So no more than a natural phenomenon. So that's can be overcome, but it's not using just the purely the setback, which is going to prevent people doing anything. It's basically a land take in that area away. So.
Okay, well, that's an interesting comment, Shang. Thank you for that. And I heard 2 votes here for please put that comment in writing to us and make sure you look at the slope setback when you're writing that comment. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Marie, I see Marie. I think we still have a few more minutes. So I see Marie with her hand up. Marie?
Can you hear me?
Maria, sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. I don't have my headset today. Just in response to the Xing Wang's comment, that is a value, a good point. However, local stormwater bylaws in each community may handle that. It depends on if they're an MS4 community, but it would, it might not be a bad idea to have it in the Wetlands Protection Act, or maybe as guidance in the handbook. But I just wanted to point out that that's something that I'm an environmental engineer in the town of Brookline, and we always review how close these systems are because of breakout and because it's like such a huge concern when you have hilly terrain and shallow groundwater and glacial till and lots of things that really complicate trying to force the water from impervious surfaces into the ground. So it's a very complex thing, and it's a point well taken. So I just wanted to respond to that.
Okay, and we would appreciate you also, making that comment.
I mean, we have a whole class of projects, and I'm not going to mention what kind they are, but we have hills actually eroding down to the flat land below it. And suppose this land use doesn't generate any runoff. And it just happens time and time again. It's a continual problem. Slopes,
steeper slopes make runoff go faster.
Absolutely.
Right. Yes, that's a great. I'm involved in many, so Brookline, Newton, the whole area. So Tom, it's really definitely valid question, but I don't think it's going to solve just by the setback. To be honest, if you on a hill, even you're 50 feet away, if it's a discharge point, the design then consider adequate energy dissipation and engineering erosion control design, that water is going to funnel less than 50 feet. They're going to become concentrated flow. If the slope is continuously steep, they're going to erode. So there's no question, right? So we know that's a natural phenomenon. So, but I say to solving that problem is not just by limiting people cannot do one basin or two basins. Probably one basin is not enough. You have to consider the exit or the flow paths erosion control. So just like if you have a swale is steeper than 5%, you have to use check dams, vegetation, all that measures. You cannot say, the water cannot run down more than 5% of slope because that's what they are. So you cannot, we just fiscally, we cannot limit it, the water go or whatever the mother nature already created there. We can only do to minimize that impact and giving people questions or challenges, but not binding their hands to let them to coming up with good, really creative solutions to solve the problem.
All right, and thank you. And I want to go back to Maria, make sure has finished her comment, and then I see Terry Maitland after Maria.
Yeah, I'm finished. I just want to make it clear that any community that is subject to the municipal separate storm sewer permit has to have had already adopted a stormwater management bylaw or ordinance, depending on their town or city. And some of these setback things may be in a local bylaw. That's all I just wanted to emphasize.
Okay, thank you. Terry? Oh, you're muted, Terry. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay. Yeah, just a quick question. I know there's going to be a 6-month grace period after enactment, it sounds as if, but when do you expect the enactment to actually take place?
We think it will
slide back.
We think that it will probably be sometime in the late spring or summer.
Okay. So
it would be by the end of the year that the stormwater standards would be implemented, but the other standards that are proposed would take effect right away.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, we are at time.
Might have one more question.
Can you please keep it? Can you please keep it brief for everybody's?
Yes, I I know that resilience means we really want to making things work effectively to really solving our problem, not to be binding people's hand to be creative and to solve problems. And there's one thing comments through my practice over 30 years in Massachusetts, I realized that just for the infiltration portion, I think we need to have some thought on it. In many communities, they have lots of basement flooding. To put in the requirement, some of the places groundwater recharge was oxymoron in my view, because people's basement is flooded. You put in more water there, it's going to have a bigger, some pumps put in, and they're going to pump in the water to the sewer or dumping on the surface. So it's basically counterproductive. And also from the recharge for the natural design, I know the high groundwater, seasonal high groundwater is important, but on the other hand, we need to understand the nature that how much the water they can really take. Above the capacity they can take is going to break out somewhere, it's going to flood somebody somewhere. So those things is very critical. So I'm working like in a community like Wellesley. They have hundreds of families have some pump in the basement, and at the same time, because of unfortunately, we have to forcing people put the water back in their land, end up recycling. So this is like real problems out of there. We cannot ignore it by doing this and putting some of the requirement in our local bylaw or the state law.
So Deshang,
we
do you have
really
a
need to look
question?
into if that can provide an effective measure to solve
Pardon me for
problems.
interrupting. I just want to know if you have a question in there or something that you're asking of us, or is this a comment you want to put in your comments when you submit them? I didn't hear a question in there.
The question is, I feel the regulation or the new any measures we call the resilience is not resilient. It's probably causing people more harm than doing good in some aspect. We need to looking into it and consider it.
So just to, a brief response, Deshang, thank you for your, thought on that. By putting more water into the ground, we are preventing it from going into undersized municipal drain systems that are currently need relief. You see a lot of the flooding that's happening today is as a result of undersized drainage systems. So the peak rate attenuation and recharge standards will help by keeping more of the water on site, by recharging our aquifers and our base flows in our river systems during drought, and by eliminating floods that happen, because the systems currently to handle the water are undersized, which also causes pollution of our waters. So those are the reasons why we are proposing this, and we appreciate your input as well. So we look forward to seeing your comments on March 1st or before. And are there any final questions? Because we're going, it's after 8 o'clock.
I think we need to be respectful of people's evenings. It's after 8, and so I really appreciate folks coming out tonight. We've dwindled down to 27, but we had quite a critical mass. All your questions really help us think through, as we go from draft to final. As Lisa said, there is one more public information session followed by 3 public hearings. The link to these presentations is in the chat a couple of times. And very soon we will get these recordings downloaded and put up on the website as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for your participation tonight.
Right, the presentations are already up on MassDEP's website. So if you Google MassDEP wetlands information and go to the wetland regulations section, the presentations are already posted. So
and that link is in the chat a few different times.
Yeah, I would know. So I would like to say final word. I really appreciated all the work. It's not definitely. I'm not disrespect anybody. I really appreciate it. Tom knows me for probably almost 30 years. I'm very technical, trying to put in my questions there. It's not because I don't respect, it's because I respect. And for the reason I know when I respect is in the way is we want to do the right thing and right work to get our things better. So it's not like there's no question about that. And I just as a final comments, as I said, is we consider the people's basement or safety property. It's there. That's also real need. And the municipal pipelines capacity is another one. Just like if we have a highway, don't have capacity, we say you cannot go to the highway. That's not the right solution to some degree philosophically. So we need to make our highway effective and to probably manage the traffic and the cars of traffic sensing better. So it's the same reason. If the municipal stormwater system is not big enough to take in water that is necessary to safeguard people's home and to protect them from flooding. So it means that things need to be thinking in both ways, not just say you cannot dump water a street.
Point well taken. Thank you. We so appreciate everybody for being here tonight. Thank you so much for being here, for your questions, for your input, and we look forward to seeing your comments, but we appreciate your time for being here today. Have a good night, everybody. It's already after 8, so thanks again for your participation.